Number 10. Franchesca D Rem shipwreck. Built in 1942, the Franchesca D Rem was an Italian-owned cargo ship that transported war supplies for the Axis powers during World War II. While carrying a full load of gun shells, explosives, and other ammunition for German troops in North Africa in 1944, the vessel encountered engine problems and anchored off the Croatian island of Kaprijke. It was struck by 2 torpedoes from British Spitfire aircraft and sank during an air raid, taking its explosive cargo with it to the sea floor. The Franchesca D Rem is one of 2 Italian ships that sank off Croatia during the conflict. The other, originally called the Giuseppe Deza and renamed the TA-35 for German use, was a minesweeper that also sank at the hands of the British. It met a particularly violent end, breaking in 2 before it came to rest in its watery grave roughly 6 miles off the Croatian coast. Number 9. Doggerland. During the last ice age, a vast swath of territory connected what is now Britain to mainland Europe. Known as Doggerland, it functioned as a seasonal hunting ground for Mesolithic hunter-gatherer societies. As glaciers melted toward the end of the Ice Age, the hills, marshes, and valleys and swamps that once dominated the landscape became vulnerable to rising sea levels. Doggerland was ultimately wiped out by a tsunami around 8,000 years ago, leaving Britain separated from the rest of Europe as we know it today. Parts of Doggerland initially survived in the form of small islands and continued to be inhabited for roughly 1,000 years before they too sank into the sea. Its existence is known by the growing array of artifacts that have been recovered from now submerged sites where human ancestors once camped, ate, hunted, and made tools. Included among the collection are hyena remains, flint tools, artwork, and ancient human and Neanderthal bones. In recent years, researchers have been trying to locate evidence of a submerged Stone Age settlement, which theoretically should be possible since thousands of people were thought to inhabit Doggerland at any given time throughout its existence. Mesolithic dwellings have been found just off the coast of Denmark, along with dugout canoes, textile fragments, and other objects left behind by people who were eventually displaced by the rising waters. Number 8. A shark that shouldn't be there. Scientists admittedly know little about the Greenland shark, which has the longest known lifespan of all vertebrates and is thought to live for anywhere between 250 and 500 years. That means that some of the Greenland sharks swimming in the world's oceans today may have been alive when the founding fathers of the United States signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Until recently, this enigmatic, seldom-seen species was thought to dwell primarily in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic and Arctic Oceans. At up to 23 feet long and weighing as much as 1.5 tons, Greenland sharks are the largest known fish found in Arctic waters. But researchers' understanding of the creature was upended in 2022, when a specimen was observed in the Western Caribbean, thousands of miles from its typical northerly range. A team of researchers led by Devanshi Kasana accidentally captured it while tagging tiger sharks with a team of fishermen off the Belizean coast. They were unable to collect a DNA sample, but they snapped photos of the specimen and consulted shark experts, who agreed that it was most likely a Greenland shark. Thanks to this wildly out-of-place sighting, experts are now rethinking their entire understanding of the Greenland shark's distribution. It seems as though these creatures never fail to surprise even the most experienced scientists, leaving them to wonder what they'll learn about the mysterious creature next. Number 7. The Yellow Submarine of Barbados. Barbados is famous for offering some of the world's best diving locations, where visitors can explore at least 17 wrecks in the crystal blue Caribbean Sea. Off the island's west coast, there's a yellow submarine that tends to take divers by surprise. It's located near the Pamir, a German-built cargo ship that sank during a hurricane in 1957. The Yellow Submarine reportedly belonged to a property tycoon who owned land on Barbados. According to the story, he always wanted a submarine of his own, so he went ahead and bought it without thinking of the price of maintaining it. When the costs of owning the vessel got out of control, the man decided that it wasn't such a fun idea to own a submarine after all. Eager to get rid of it, he simply dumped it near the shore and forgot about it. Another legend claims that the man had ordered a customized submarine to show off to his friends when they visited him in Barbados, but it wasn't finished on time, so he had a replica made just to give them an idea of what the final product would look like. After his guests saw the replica, the eccentric businessman allegedly had it sunk to the seafloor near his yacht. It's hard to know which of these stories, if any, are true, because there's not much information about the submarine or its owner, including his name or when he tossed it into the sea. Would you ever travel underwater in a submarine? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 6. The world's largest plant. In Shark Bay, off Australia's westernmost point, a vast patch of seagrass the size of Cincinnati covers the ocean floor. Known as Poseidon's ribbonweed, the 70-square-mile blanketing of vegetation is considered the world's largest plant. Some even argue that it's the world's largest living organism. It's roughly 4,500 years old and grows by cloning itself. Researchers made the discovery when they tested samples from 10 underwater seagrass meadows as part of a genetic diversity study. In an unexpected twist of irony, they were shocked to realize that the plants were genetically identical. Things only got more bizarre from there. Unlike most seagrasses, which inherit half of each parent's genome, Poseidon's ribbonweed inherits the entire genome of each parent, a condition known as polyploidy. It appears to be a hybrid species and has proven to be impressively resilient, withstanding extreme conditions including a variety of temperatures, salinity levels, and intense light. In an environment where many, if not most, plants would struggle to survive, this mysterious seagrass has thrived. Number 5. The ancient city of Dwarka. According to Hindu tradition, an ancient fortified city called Dwarka served as the home of the kingdom of Krishna. Upon Krishna's death, the metropolis sank into the Arabian Sea. Searches for the city began as far back as the 1930s. Over the last half-century, archaeologists have uncovered numerous submerged artifacts, including stone blocks, pillars, and anchors, but they've not been able to determine the precise age of the objects that have been retrieved. Evidence indicates the presence of submerged settlements, suggesting that the flourishing port city described in ancient texts was in fact real. There are also traces of what could be the foundation of the city's wall, although estimates of its age vary widely from as far back as 3000 BC to as recent as the Middle Ages. Depending on when Dwarka experienced its heyday, it may have played an important role in India's trade relations with the Arab societies. For now, Dwarka's true age is unclear, and its final days are also somewhat of a mystery. Experts have theorized that coastal erosion was responsible for plunging Dwarka into the sea, indicating that its demise may have been triggered by a natural disaster. Number 4. Unidentified Indian Ocean wrecks. During an expansive search for any trace of the missing Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 plane in 2015, researchers discovered at least 2 previously unknown 19th century shipwrecks in the Indian Ocean. They first appeared on sonar images, and because they weren't what their discoverers were looking for, the findings were passed on to researchers who spent the next few years trying to identify the ships. Located roughly 1,429 miles southwest off of Western Australia, the 2 remote wrecks sit just 22 miles apart at a depth of more than 2.3 miles, making them the deepest shipwrecks ever found in the Indian Ocean. One of them appears to be a British vessel and may be the brig W. Gordon or the bark Magdala. Based on incomplete records from the time period it most likely dates back to. W. Gordon vanished with 10 crew members aboard during a voyage from Scotland to Australia in 1877, while the Magdala disappeared in 1882 while traveling from Wales to Indonesia. Evidence from the wreck site suggests that the ship exploded and sank while carrying coal, which may have caused a combustible buildup of methane gas below deck. The other wreck is believed to be a bark called the West Ridge, which vanished in 1883 during a voyage from England to India with 28 crew members aboard. It's unclear what caused the ship to sink, but its location indicates that the vessel may have been traveling in the direction of the nearest possible help. It's unlikely that researchers will ever definitively identify the wrecks, according to maritime archaeologist Ross Anderson, who told The Guardian that the project would require a major influx of funding from a generous benefactor due to the ship's depth and remoteness. Number 3. Mahabalom. Shortly before the devastating 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami barreled into the city of Mahabalom, the water receded to an extreme degree, and a row of what appeared to be a man-made structure consisting of granite boulders briefly appeared. After hearing about the unusual sighting, archaeologists explored the area and found evidence of an ancient port city. Roughly 2,600 feet from the shoreline and roughly 27 feet of water, the team located a 33-foot-long wall, a small staircase, and a scattering of chiseled stone blocks. Many of the structures were reportedly covered in growth while others were heavily damaged, making them difficult to identify. But they appeared to be part of a larger building complex that experts believe is somewhere between 1,100 and 1,500 years old. The team also found evidence of older brick buildings which may date as far back as the Sangam period, which lasted from 300 BC to 200 AD. Considering how sea levels have steadily risen over the last several thousand years, it's not hard to believe that an ancient coastal town would end up underwater. But the discovery was especially significant because some believe it may be one of 6 ancient temples of Hindu legend that were swallowed by the ocean. Not all experts agree, and some even remain stubbornly resigned to the belief that the temples were purely mythical. But others have opened their minds to the possibility that at some point, legend and history intersect. Number 2. Mystery Warship. In 2019, researchers discovered a visibly old shipwreck in the English Channel off the coast of Sussex. Its identity eluded them for the next 3 years as they made dozens of return dives to the site in an effort to trace its origins. In early 2023, they were confident enough to announce that they had identified the wreck as a 17th century Dutch warship called the Klein Hollandia. Built in 1656, the ship was involved in the major battles of the Second Anglo-Dutch War. While sailing from the Mediterranean to the Netherlands in 1672, during the Third Anglo-Dutch War, the Klein Hollandia was attacked by an English squadron. It sank with a load of luxury cargo including Italian marble tiles and pottery, which ultimately helped researchers identify the wreck, along with a wood sample analysis and other evidence. The team also found bronze and iron cannons at the site. Given its historical importance, the site has been granted the highest level of legal protection available. Number 1. Ocean forests. The world's oceans are filled with sprawling kelp and seaweed forests that scientists are only now discovering the size of. Many, if not most of these vast expanses of aquatic vegetation don't even have a name. Collectively, they cover an area larger than the Amazon rainforest and are roughly twice the size of India, according to recent research. The largest species of plants that are found within sea forests can grow tens of meters high. Just like terrestrial foliage, they undergo photosynthesis and provide nourishment and shelter to other life forms in the surrounding environment. Researchers have assigned names to some of the world's most productive sea forests, including the Great African Sea Forest and Australia's Great Southern Reef. These habitats grow at a rapid speed, with some sea forests in more temperate regions producing multiple times more biomass every year than intensely farmed crops like wheat, rice, and corn. Experts are hopeful that sea forests could play a role in mitigating climate change and combating food insecurity throughout the world, but are still admittedly learning about these mysterious environments. Number 7. Runit Dome, Marshall Islands. The Runit Concrete Dome lies in the middle of one of the Marshall Islands, and the locals are pretty worried about it. Not because this site has historic significance that needs to be shielded from rising sea levels, but because Runit Dome is one of the most dangerous locations on the planet. Between 1946 and 1958, the Marshall Islands were used by the United States as a nuclear testing ground. They dropped about 67 bombs on, in, and above the islands, vaporizing entire land masses, gouging craters into shallow lagoons, and displacing hundreds of people who were forced to leave their homes forever. Afterwards, U.S. officials cleaned up polluted soil on Enewetak Atoll, where they not only performed the majority of their tests, but also conducted a dozen biological weapons experiments. They deposited tons of dirt from a radioactive Nevada testing site, as well as the most dangerous debris from the atoll into a pile, before covering it all with a concrete dome to keep the radioactive and toxic material contained, including lethal amounts of plutonium. In total, the amount of toxic and radioactive waste in the dome could fill over 35 Olympic-sized swimming pools. That's why the locals have a very different name for Runit Dome. They call it the Tomb. Now, the tomb is a lot more similar to a ticking time bomb. The concrete is at risk of collapsing due to rising sea levels, which threaten to break it apart. Locals have told the United States about their problem, but the official U.S. government stance is that the Runit Dome is the Marshall Islands problem to deal with. This comes off the back of an agreement signed in 1986 between the two countries, which removed any further liability from the United States over matters on Marshallese soil. This would all be great if you don't consider the fact that the documents were signed with many key details and issues hidden, such as the fact that nuclear waste was transported from Nevada to be disposed of on Enewetak Atoll, and that they conducted biological weapons tests on the island, including some in which they used airborne bacteria. The Runit Dome is already leaking, too. Studies carried out on Enewetak have found areas where radiation levels are on par with Chernobyl and Fukushima. Although the Marshall Islands have lobbied for compensation and had these claims rule in their favor, they won a $2 billion claim in 1988 as a result of the Nuclear Claims Tribunal, which was set up after the agreement. The U.S. only ever paid $4 million in damages to the country, though. Number 6. The Aal Sea, Kazakhstan. A desert might be a weird place to look for fishing boats, but that's exactly where you can find them in Kazakhstan. A few fishing trawlers are moored hundreds of miles from the Aal Sea, the world's fourth largest inland sea, which has been shrinking in size year after year. That's because the Soviet Union diverted the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya rivers in the 1960s for cotton and rice farms. This action turned the Aal Sea into an arid desert. The Soviet Union didn't seem to care about the effects on local fishing communities, like those living in Moynak, which was once a bustling fishing port. Instead, happy that cotton production increased, they turned a blind eye to the plight of these people. Over time, the remaining water became less and less. The salt levels were highly concentrated, killing off the fish which the people had once used as their source of income. Locals began leaving their homes, creating ghost towns. Moynak was one of them. The Aal Sea was no longer a place people could live. With no food source or income and a harsh, dry climate, it's hardly a welcoming environment. Although there have been efforts to restore some parts of the body of water, such as the North Aral Sea in Kazakhstan, not much can be done, and it remains a tenth of its original size. Number 5. Bosa State, Nigeria. Bosa State in Nigeria was once a natural paradise, helping to sustain the lives of its people with bountiful harvests on their farms and plentiful fish from the Niger Delta. Today, though, locals are slowly dying and struggling to survive as the place turns into a toxic nightmare. It was discovered that the area is rich in oil, so many big companies began exploiting the land without caring about the toll on the local environment or people. Shell began pumping oil in Bosa in 1956, and many other companies soon followed suit. Every year, about 40 million liters of oil are dumped through the Niger Delta thanks to this process, leaving the local people and wildlife less and less able to cope. Locals of Bosa State face pollution in the air, on land, and in the water. Large portions of the state's rivers and mangrove swamps have been destroyed. Oil has engulfed farmland, polluting crops and subjecting people to toxic metals, including chromium, lead, and mercury. Gas flares from the refineries also blast noxious fumes into the air and create harmful acid rain. Now, crops fail, and where fishermen could once make up most of their day's catch within an hour or two, there are no fish at all. What makes this even more alarming is that 3/4 of the population relied on fishing or farming as their main source of income. Not only has the pollution affected livelihoods, but it has had impacts on the general health of the people of Bosa State. Here, the life expectancy is now only 45, with many people dying prematurely from preventable diseases and cancers, most likely caused by pollution and toxic waste. In 2011 alone, over 16,000 babies died within a month of being born, with all of their deaths being linked to the pollution in the Niger Delta. People are now calling for more action to be taken by the oil companies that have caused such devastation without a care in the world. Groups like the Rise for Bosa campaign are fighting hard to represent those that have been affected, to get the proper remediation and compensation they deserve. What would you do if you discovered nuclear waste hidden in your backyard? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Number 4. Fukushima Prefecture, Japan. On March 11, 2011, a 9.0 magnitude earthquake struck Japan, knocking out much of the external power for the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station. After this, a huge tsunami came in, causing more damage. As the power had been cut by the earthquake, the nuclear plant was running on its backup generators, many of which were located in its basement. The tsunami, with its 45-foot tall waves, destroyed the backup power system, meaning that there was no power able to cool the reactors, leading to 3 of them going into meltdown. The plant workers tried to vent the reactors to stop them from exploding, but the efforts were too little, too late. The hydrogen explosions pushed the radiation even further out into the atmosphere, leading to the evacuation zone being expanded from 3 kilometers all the way to 20 kilometers in less than 24 hours. Over the next few days, the scope of the radiation created the oblong shape which is now the Fukushima evacuation zone. By the end of April of that year, over 160,000 people had been temporarily moved from their homes. Despite the triple tragedy of the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown, this seemed to encourage morbid tourists to visit Fukushima Prefecture despite the obvious dangers. There were so many international sightseers determined to see the aftermath that the Japanese authorities had to put signs up in English to warn people the area was off limits. In the years since, some towns have been reopened and residents allowed to return. There is still a red zone to the northwest of the power plant, which stretches 20 kilometers. With special governmental permission, there are tours that operate in the red zone to help educate those curious about the effects of the Fukushima disaster and the subsequent cleanup campaign. Attendees can see a freeze frame of life in 2011, with closed stores still having items on the racks and colorful streets left completely deserted. The plan is to continue restoring the area, with many of these stores, streets, and buildings ready to be knocked down to start new. Despite this, though, it's unknown who, if anyone, will return to their former homes. One of the reopened areas, Odaka Town, only has 3,500 people there, as opposed to its previous population of 13,000 before the disaster. Many of these locals are the elderly, who don't need to worry about jobs and don't fear the threat of radiation. Many other families have simply settled down elsewhere. Number 3. The Cree Dump, Ohio. The Cree Dump was just a few miles from Cleveland, next to the Cuyahoga River. It contained thousands of rusting cars and barrels that were left to leak toxic chemicals into the surrounding area. Its 45 acres were certainly not suitable for anyone to visit while waste was being dumped here between 1948 and 1980, and even afterward the site was still a festering toxic eyesore. The area was so polluted that in 1969 a section of the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. This wasn't a one-time thing either. It happened about 13 times. The city of Cleveland was a poster child for the ecological damage and pollution taking place all over America, and in the following years, it would even lead to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970 and the Clean Water Act in 1972. But what about the Cree dump itself? An effort from the National Park Service aimed to clean it up, but before they could get to work, the site needed to be closed off as a Superfund lawsuit was taken out against the site by the U.S. government. This concluded in 2002, so the team could finally get to work. What they found was shocking. There were millions of tons of contaminated soil, and the river near it had no fish. In some places, it was so polluted that there was no oxygen reading in the water at all. They had to dig up to 25 feet deep to get rid of all the toxic soil. Over 20 long and grueling years, they managed to take it from a dump site to wetlands inhabited by bird species and plant life. In December 2021, the area officially became part of the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, a place for everyone to enjoy safely. Number 2. The toxic waste sites of America. Did you know that 1 in every 6 Americans lives within 3 miles of a hazardous waste site without even realizing it? Some sites are visible across the country, while others are hidden in plain sight, such as abandoned factories or industrial plants. Often referred to as Superfund sites, these toxic wastelands are dangerous to those living around them. Studies have shown that people within a 1.8-mile radius of a Superfund face a high risk of developing health issues. This is particularly concerning when you realize that 21 million people live close to toxic waste sites in the United States alone, putting them at risk of exposure to deadly chemicals. People living near these sites are at an increased risk of developing lifelong mental and physical issues, such as cancer, birth defects, and developmental disabilities. The younger you are, the more risk you face, since children are more sensitive to chemical exposure. They consume more air, food, and water per unit of body weight. According to research, living near hazardous waste sites can shorten people's lives by an average of 1.2 years. Climate change could also make the risk worse. Weather events like floods, storms, or high winds could destabilize some of these waste sites, leading to the chemicals being released into the air, ground, and nearby waterways. Now, the burden is on all forms of government to enact policies to limit hazardous sites and to clean up existing locations for the benefit of local communities. Number 1. Pripyat, Ukraine. On April 26, 1986, the town of Pripyat, Ukraine was getting ready for May Day celebrations. The fair was in town, and banners with the Soviet Union's hammer and sickle motif decorated lampposts lining the streets. The town was near Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and on that day, the reactor happened to explode, sending radioactive gases out across the surrounding area. The nuclear devastation was so widespread that it even affected and irradiated soil in other European countries. The entirety of Pripyat and the surrounding area were evacuated and made into a nuclear exclusion zone, barring entry to the public and denying anyone who once lived there the ability to go home. Toys still litter the floor of a classroom where children once played, and personal belongings were simply left discarded on the streets. Although the population of Pripyat was evacuated, the town was never fully deserted. Officials and workers involved in the cleanup effort were still living at the site, and to keep them going, some essential businesses like a laundromat to wash their work clothing stayed open. But for the general public, the area was forbidden and only frequented by brave journalists and urban explorers. But in recent years, Pripyat has seen a tourist boom. So long as you get a day pass from the government in Kyiv, you can tour Pripyat and the surrounding villages. Due to the lack of upkeep in Pripyat, though, access inside any of the buildings is off limits for fear that they could collapse. Radiation levels on the tour are kept to a minimum, and everyone on a tour is checked for radiation at the beginning and at the end of the day. A stay any longer than this, though, could still be dangerous and have long-term effects, so for many, it is a once-in-a-lifetime destination.
Submarine that turned into a ticking time bomb. The K-19 was the first nuclear-powered submarine invented by the Soviet Union. Construction started on October 17, 1958, on what would later become known as the 658 class submarine. The vessel was 374 feet long, with a stretching beam 30 feet. It was armed with R-13 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBM. The R-13 was a single-stage liquid fuel rocket and was 38.9 feet long. It first launched in 1961. The missile was the first Soviet design to use a small set of rocket engines to adjust course and trajectory instead of aerodynamic control surfaces. But 4 stabilizers were used to keep the missile on track during early flight. The end result was a missile with a range of 370 miles, and the ability to deliver intense nuclear explosions. It only took 2 years for the K-19 to be finished, with many seeing her as a rushed job. So why were the Soviets so keen on completing the submarine quickly? Although they were further ahead of the United States at this point in the space race, with the successful launch of Sputnik 1, the late 50s and early 60s were in the full swing of the Cold War, with both countries trying to show that they were superior. The USS Nautilus was launched in 1958 by the United States. Because it was nuclear-powered and didn't need fuel refills like diesel engine vessels, the Nautilus set multiple records, including the first submersible to reach the geographic North Pole, as well as the first submerged journey around the Arctic. Of course, this wasn't something the Soviets let slide, and so they felt obliged to create their own nuclear submarine, quickly. The construction of the K-19 prioritized having a nuclear sub in the water as soon as possible. This meant that often corners were cut, and the work was so rushed that there were countless accidents during her creation, leading to the deaths of 10 workers. A fire killed 2 workmen. Then, 6 women who were gluing rubber liners to a water cistern died from inhaling the fumes. An electrician was killed when he was crushed by a missile tube cover, while fellow workers were loading missiles at the same time, and an engineer died after slipping. One accident, which seemed quite innocent compared to those, involved a small piece of solder dripping down onto one of the coolant pipes for the submarine's nuclear reactor, creating a crack in the metal that went unnoticed by engineers. It would be this small mistake that spelled the K-19's demise. But that wouldn't be for some time, since first the K-19 needed to be launched and celebrated. For that, she would need a captain. That honor went to Nikolai Vladimirovich Zatayev. Formerly a navigation officer, Zatayev had shown promise and had even been noted by Russian war hero Georgy Zhukov. As a result, he was promoted to the rank of captain and was in command of the very first nuclear submarine for his country. Despite this, finding a crew proved difficult. Many Soviet naval officers doubted the combat readiness of the sub, especially with how quickly it was built. To combat this, sailors who chose to work aboard the nuclear submarine fleet were tempted by superior rations, including smoked fish, cheeses, sausages, and even gourmet chocolate. This food was a cut way above what other crews received at the time, causing many to enlist despite the dangers. Then, before she engaged in active service, K-19 would undertake various testing procedures. On July 12, 1960, she made her first test voyage and spent 4 days at sea. She was then brought back for further adjustments before heading out again on a longer test trip, this time between August 12 and November 8, 1960, during which she traveled 10,779 miles. These test runs weren't without their trials and tribulations. The crew noticed that a lot of the hull's rubber coating had detached after coming out of a full-power run, and the entire surface of the boat needed to be recoated. After a test dive to her maximum depth of 980 feet, the reactor department started flooding. Worried about what may happen, the order was sent out for the sub to immediately resurface. Since the vessel hadn't been able to get rid of the excess water, once she reached the surface of the ocean, the extra weight caused her to turn over onto her port side. Investigations were then made to find out what had caused the problem. As with many things that went wrong on board K-19, this too boiled down to the rushed nature of her construction. While she was being built, engineers failed to replace a broken gasket, which allowed water to flow in. In October 1960, the 9th compartment was flooded. This time it wasn't a faulty gasket, but instead the work of the galley crew who'd fed wood from the equipment crates into the waste system, clogging it and causing the flood. Just 4 days after her return, K-19 was declared finished on November 12, 1960. That wasn't the end of her problems though, since just 1 month later in December of that year, a coolant leak caused a circuit pump failure. Thankfully, experts from the shipbuilding yard at Severodvinsk, where K-19 was originally laid down during her construction, were able to travel out to the submarine and fix the issue while she was at sea. The process took about a week. Before we continue, make sure you leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you've enjoyed the video so far. Now, back to the action. Finally, the submarine was officially launched on June 4, 1961. As if it was heralding the bad luck that would plague K-19, when it came time to christen her, not only did the honor go to a man, traditionally it's performed by a woman, the bottle of champagne used to strike her hull bounced off the rubber lining instead of shattering. She had a crew of 139 men, as well as observed officers who were not part of the crew but were there to oversee and give feedback on the submarine's progress to Russian officials who were invested in the project. Things were not exactly simple sailing once she set out to sea. But then again, given everything that happened before she was finally commissioned, you probably knew this was coming. On July 4, 1961, K-19 was patrolling the waters of the North Atlantic Ocean on a training mission when disaster suddenly struck. During routine maneuvers, the flow of coolant to the reactor stopped altogether. Normally, nuclear reactors have a backup system to make sure that if one coolant system fails, another one can be fired up to take over and avoid a nuclear meltdown. But the K-19, most likely due to the hurried circumstances under which she was built, didn't have one of these safeguards. Captain Zatayev, in his very first command post as captain of a ship, was faced with something that none of his fellow crew had ever experienced. Not only that, but there was the fear that if the reactor did actually explode, thanks to the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, NATO and the United States may see it as an attempted nuclear strike. This could then lead to a preemptive attack on the Soviet Union in retaliation, and as a result, start World War III. Unsurprisingly, the situation threatened to overwhelm Zatayev, and he even commented in later interviews about the submarine that there had been a temptation at that moment to rush down to his cabin and hold a pistol to his head, instead of dealing with the weight of so many men's lives on his shoulders. But Zatayev managed to pull himself together and face the dire reality of the situation. He asked for volunteers from the engineering crew who would be willing to fix the issue. Although this may sound like a simple task, Zatayev knew the gravity of what he was asking these volunteers to do. K-19 did not have any protective material and clothing on board, and the best they could find was raincoats and gas masks. Anyone who chose to go to the reactor and saw the cooling system would likely die from radiation. 22 men volunteered despite the dangers. Headed down into the submarine, they managed to rig together an improvised coolant system and carefully install it by hand. K-19 and her crew had been saved, but for the 22 volunteers, their fates were sealed. Despite the fact that they tried to take as many preventative measures as possible, including working in groups of 3 for only 5 to 10 minutes at a time in the irradiated space, it wasn't enough. Zatayev remembers walking one of the first volunteers down to the reactor room and asking the man Boris Korchilov if he knew exactly what he signed up for. Boris turned to him and said, "I know, Comrade Captain." 5 minutes later, Boris stumbled out of the reactor room, took off his mask and immediately vomited. Even for that short amount of time, he and the other 21 other men had taken far more than a lethal radiation dose. The effects of the radiation on their bodies showed almost immediately. Exposed skin turned red and their hands and feet swelled up. Blood vessels rose to the surface and their hairline bled. Just 2 hours after their exposure, a lot of the men were completely unrecognizable to their fellow crewmates. The volunteers died in excruciating pain, unable to move as the radiation ate away at their bodies. Some of them, although only able to manage just the faintest of whispers, asked to be put out of their misery. Within the next week or so, 8 of them were dead. Within the next 2 years, the rest followed. All 22 men, although managing to avoid a disaster that could have been on a global scale, lost their lives thanks to the reactor room of K-19. The question was what K-19 could do next. The long-range radio system had already broken, so they weren't able to contact anyone in Moscow to send out help. There was also the issue of a very frightened crew after narrowly avoiding a nuclear meltdown. so much so that a mutiny was feared. Zetayev had all small arms on the submarine thrown overboard to avoid this temptation. The submarine then sent out a low distress signal and headed towards where it knew other diesel-powered submarines were located. A few US vessels also picked up the signal, but Zetayev ignored them. Even in their time of need, he could not give up state secrets once they realized the K-19 wasn't simply a regular Russian sub. Thankfully, S-270 picked up the distress transmission and went out to help. The crew was evacuated onto S-270, and K-19 was towed back to base. There, the submarine didn't stop her wave of destruction. Once docked, K-19 radioactively contaminated over 2,300 feet around her, as well as the engineers that worked to repair her over a period of 2 years. Even more disturbingly, the entire radioactive compartment was stripped bare from the submarine and dumped into the Aal Sea. An investigation also took place, looking for the cause of the incident. With this, it was finally revealed that the tiny crack in the coolant pipe during her construction had been the main reason behind the radioactive disaster. A welder had forgotten to place the asbestos drop cloths onto the pips in order to protect them from welding sparks, and a spark hit one of the coolant pipes, causing an invisible crack. Over time and pressure, the crack eventually formed and opened wider, resulting in the coolant system failure. Once she was fully repaired, K-19 re-entered service, but this time with a new unofficial name. Thanks to the death toll she accrued through radiation, including some of those who were repairing her, as well as some crew members who were not part of the 22 volunteers, many started to call her Hiroshima. Although the next few years of her service would be uneventful, in 1969, K-19 was yet again involved in an incident. K-19 collided with the attack submarine USS Gato in the Barents Sea on November 15th. The collision severely wrecked the sonar equipment at her bow and distorted the front torpedo tube covers. Thankfully, she resurfaced and was repaired at port with no lives lost. As for the USS Gato, it was pretty much unscathed by the collision and carried on. A fire broke out on February 24, 1972, while the submarine was about 390 feet underwater, nearly 800 miles off the Canadian coast. The crew of K-12 was evacuated once the ship surfaced. 12 men, though, remained on board, trapped in the aft torpedo room with no light or heat. A strong wind delayed towing, and rescuers were unable to access the torpedo room thanks to the inaccessible engine room. On April 4th, K-19 was towed to Severomorsk, and the sailors were finally rescued after enduring 24 days in the lightless, heatless chamber. Almost 30 ships participated in the rescue effort, which lasted more than 40 days. Although the men in the torpedo chamber lived, 30 sailors were killed in the fire, which was caused by a hydraulic fluid spill, according to investigators. K-19 went on to cost the life of another sailor in 1982, when 2 crew members were seriously burned by an electrical short circuit. V.A. Kravchuk, one of the men, died from his injuries 5 days after the incident. K-19 continued to serve her country until she was finally decommissioned on April 19, 1990. She was taken to the Nerpa shipyard in 2002 to be scrapped. Over her 29 years of service, she was operational for 20,223 hours and traveled over 332,396 miles. The legacy of K-19 lives on in her crew members. Those on board during the major nuclear incident in 1961, including Captain Zetayev, were nominated by ex-Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006 for their bravery. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed learning about K-19 and her crew, and how their actions helped avoid nuclear disaster and war. Let us know in the comments below what part you found the most interesting. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. See you next time. Bye.